Starships and space combat look great on the big screen, but when converted to tabletop RPGs, can leave something to be desired. In this episode, I'm going to discuss some of the challenges I've experienced running and playing in games with space combat. The challenges I'm referring to are not specific to Phantasy Star, or Esper Genesis, or even the D20 system. While every RPG has its pros and cons, and some handle space combat better than others, these are universal challenges, and I'm hoping to give some universal solutions as well. Challenge number 1. Including everybody. When we watch space combat in our favorite movies, or our favorite shows, the camera's always exactly where it needs to be. We're always in the middle of the action. This requires certain characters to drop into the background. They're irrelevant, and so they pop up again whenever the action clears and they're able to contribute to the story again. In a role-playing game, your player characters are your audience, and so if you force some of those characters into the background, the people playing those characters are going to have a pretty boring time. My friends and I played Star Wars Saga Edition for years and years, and we always said, when the Millennium Falcon enters combat, Luke and Han jump into gunner chairs, Chewbacca takes the helm, Leia spends every turn aiding Chewbacca, R2-D2 holds his action every round waiting for something to break just to repair it, and C-3PO leaves the room to go check Reddit.
I'm a doctor, not an engineer.
It's true that player characters can't shine in every situation, but if space combat is a major component in the story, and players are building characters without skills or abilities that contribute to space combat, they're not going to have anything to do in those scenes. We could just write it off and say, well, in real life, not everybody can shine everywhere, and some people are just going to be irrelevant when space combat breaks out. And that's true in real life, but this is a game. It's fantasy, or science fiction, and that take is a little lazy as well. As storytellers, we can certainly do more to help our players. As players, we can ask our storytellers, what are the expectations, so that I can have fun with my character and build a character that is proactive to your story. As a storyteller, we can consider how important space combat is to our stories, how much we want to include it as we're running our games. And then we can inform our players that it's a major component, it's a minor component, or it depends on what our players want. If we set those expectations or work with our players to meet their expectations, then our players can build characters that really are conducive to the story that we want to tell. And if a player doesn't want to build a character that is focused on space combat, and you've told them that space combat is going to be part of your game, at least then they're making a conscious decision. They're aware that there are substantial hooks in our story that they will have to take a back seat in, and they get to decide that that's okay for them. Another solution I've heard, but haven't personally used, is giving players free skill proficiencies or special abilities related to spaceship operations and combat. This allows your players to build their characters without having to choose whether they're going to be extremely skilled off the ship, extremely capable on a ship, or mediocre at both. Another solution is having other characters on board the ship who are competent in spaceship operations and allowing your players to control those characters when starship battles break out. I personally don't like giving up control of my character to control a character created by the storyteller, and I've heard other people complain about this, calling it a living dice tower. In essence, the player begins to roll dice for a character that the storyteller normally controls, and it can remove some of the feeling of agency, where the player doesn't necessarily care whether or not the character they're now controlling lives or dies, succeeds or fails, because it's not their character. One final solution is to give the characters who don't excel at starship combat something to do on board the ship that isn't dependent on operating the vehicle. This solution is very scenario dependent. For example, you can have a stowaway enemy on board the ship who, in the middle of space combat, tries to sabotage the vehicle. Now characters on board the ship need to engage in combat with that saboteur, and they get to use skills and special abilities that aren't focused on controlling the vehicle itself. Because this is a scenario-dependent solution, you'll have to come up with these scenarios for every space combat challenges that players on board the ship who aren't operating the vehicle have to overcome. This solution can be a lot of fun, but keep in mind it can be very deadly. If half the party is controlling the vehicle, engaged in enemy starfighters, and the other half of the party is dealing with an onboard saboteur, if either battle, the space battle or the onboard battle, starts to go sour for the players, they're not in a position where they can easily pivot to help each other out. Which leads us to challenge number 2, all your eggs in one basket. Think about your favorite video game, movie, book. How often do all the main characters die in one scene and the story continues as normal? It's certainly possible, but not very typical. Death is always a possibility in role-playing combat. In a more stable environment, if one character dies, or 2 or 3, the rest of the players can still succeed and squeak through with a victory. In space combat, where all the characters are on board one vessel, if that vehicle is destroyed, everybody loses. The TPK, total party kill, can completely derail our story. Player parties rarely run for their lives, even when it's the best option, but that solution is always there. Or maybe your player's dice are really unlucky tonight, and you find that they're being overcome by enemies. In a more stable environment, like in a field, in a forest, in a dungeon, storytellers can come up with solutions to address and prevent a total party wipeout. They can remind players that running away is an option, or if all the characters are dropped, maybe those characters wake up in a prison. Now they have to come up with an escape plan. There's a lot of creative ways to make sure that your players aren't all destroyed and your story comes to a bitter end. But when we're dealing with the cold vacuum of space, it becomes a lot more deadly, and there's not a lot we can do as DMs to try and make sure the story isn't completely dismantled, as our player characters are sucked through a hole in the hull the size of a quarter, and their eyeballs begin to expand. One solution is just fudging dice. Not a big fan of this, but it certainly is a way to prevent your party from being completely wiped out, and the art of fudging dice is as old as tabletop RPGs themselves. Another solution that takes a little bit more prep or creativity is coming up with tiers of success and failure. This solution plans various outcomes for a scenario, and it depends on how well the players prep for that scenario, how well they execute tactical gameplay, or how poorly they do. For example, if characters are headed to a planet and they're ambushed by enemy starships, and the dice go perfectly for them, when the players land there's very little consequence, their ship's in good condition, they're able to continue with their mission objectives as normal. If things go middle of the road for them, they defeat their enemies but take a good amount of damage. When they land, maybe they have to spend a couple of days looking for somebody to help repair or sell them parts that they can repair the ship themselves with. They end up having to spend extra money in order to get their ship back in good shape. And if things go very poorly, they manage to escape with a very damaged ship. Not only do they have to spend funds and time trying to repair the vehicle, but enemy forces on the planet have been notified of their presence. Now they have to hide their ship, and also keep a low profile as they're looking for parts to repair the vehicle. Coming up with tiers of victory or tiers of failure can prevent a total wipeout of your party, prevent the complete destruction of your story, while still giving weight to the outcome of combat and dice rolls. This leads us to challenge number 3, fully operational, but half the options. In TTRPG combat, characters generally have 3 options on their turn. A major action like attacking or using a skill or spell, movement, which is a major part of their tactical decision-making, and then some sort of minor action like talking or activating an item. When characters are operating a vehicle, they tend to be at a station. This limits the character's options of what they can do, based on what that console or that station allows them to do. And most characters are not going to have any movement option at all, except for the pilot who's controlling where the vehicle moves. The only movement option to most other characters is to abandon their station. With the removal of movement as a character option, characters lose about half the things they can do on their turn, and half the decisions that they could normally make. Probably the most fun that my players have had in one of my Starship combats is to split the party. If you give the players multiple vehicles, it means that the players operating those vehicles are going to have more options for their characters to perform. In my own example, I gave each of my players an X-Wing in a Star Wars game I was running. Not every character was great at piloting and operating an X-Wing, but during that combat, every player's character had a full array of options to perform. They got to make their own decisions, and if one of those X-Wings was destroyed, there's one character lost, as opposed to the entire party. One character loss can be tragic, but can also create some really powerful role-playing, character decisions for the rest of the party, and most importantly, the show can still go on. Giving the party multiple vehicles doesn't always work for the story or the setting, and there's a trade-off. If the characters are all together on board one ship, there's usually a higher level of teamwork involved, as everybody is working together to control one thing. But, as with all my solutions, they're just tools in your toolbox. You don't have to use them every time, and sometimes, splitting the party up, giving them their own vehicles to operate, can really make space combat feel like something new and different, completely changing the tactics, and simultaneously addressing some of the challenges that a single vehicle with multiple players on board might face. Challenge number 4. Not enough stoves for all the cooks in the kitchen. Starships have a limited number of stations that can be occupied by your players. If you've got a large player group, but a small ship, some of those characters aren't going to have a place to sit. This can be problematic and also undo some of our efforts to address other challenges. Characters who aren't built for space combat can struggle to participate in those situations. But even a character designed for space combat is going to struggle to participate if there aren't enough stations on board their ship for them to occupy one. One way to deal with this is for players to collaborate when they're making their characters. If one player wants to play a gunner, and one player wants to play a pilot, then other players should look at the other available options on board starships in the game and see if there's something that appeals to them to build a character around that isn't piloting or gunning. Alternatively, the storyteller can just give the players more stations on board their ships. If 2 players want to play a fighter that deals with big guns on board their vessel, give that ship 2 guns so that both players can enjoy the experience and have fun with their characters. This does change the power level of the party. A ship with 2 guns is twice as deadly as a ship with 1 gun. But you can always adjust the difficulty of combat to address that increased power level of the party. You can add more enemy ships to the combat, or you can increase the hit points of the existing enemy ships so that they're a little harder to kill. I always find that it's easier to increase the difficulty of combat in the middle of combat than to decrease the difficulty once players are losing. Which leads us to our final challenge, which is that space is a whole lot of empty space. Here's your typical dungeon. There's corners and walls to navigate around, maybe some tight hallways that create choke points, doors that might be locked, lighting that can give concealment, and here's your typical battle map for space combat. Visually, space combat can be very interesting because it uses all dimensions. Ships can fly up, down, diagonal, wherever they want, and the vehicles are in constant motion. When we transfer that space combat onto your friend's pool table, it puts a lot of work on the storyteller to really fill the space of space and make it more interesting. How exciting or bland the experience of cramming space combat onto a 2D map is does depend heavily on how well the game that you're playing supports space combat. If the mechanics are designed well and give the players a lot of different options to be creative, it might be more exciting than if everybody is just moving and shooting with very little other consideration. Some simple solutions are to add obstacles, asteroids or rocks that litter the field, maybe clouds of nebulous gas that can provide cover or explode if you fire through them, broken down or derelict ships, really anything that can fill the space with obstacles to fill the environment and give players more to interact with or to avoid interacting with. You can implement other mechanics. Some games include firing arcs, which means it depends on where your ship lands in terms of the enemy ships that they can see and that they can fire upon. This adds strategy to the game. You can try and simulate 3 dimensions by adding height, representing this with blocks under the miniatures to show how high or low they're flying. You'll have to come up with a mechanic to represent what are the benefits of flying above an opponent or below them, and what are the consequences of targeting an enemy that's not on the same exact level as your ship, and come up with some sort of house rule to support. Another option is to do away with the battle map and use theater of the mind to explain what the player characters see. Some players might enjoy this kind of play, others might really dislike it. It can be difficult for them to know where everything's at when they can't see a physical representation of it. I personally have found the theater of the mind approach to work best in chase scenes, or if the ship enters orbit and now has to deal with environmental hazards like flying through a forest, avoiding trees, flying through a city and avoiding buildings. Starships tend to travel extremely fast, and so for scenes where it's more about the speed of the ships chasing each other and less about dogfighting and flying around in circles and shooting at each other, theater of the mind can be helpful because you quickly run out of space on your battle map to show the great distance that the ships are traveling. Those are some of the challenges I've run into, both running and playing in games that deal with space travel. Hopefully you found it helpful and it gives you something to think about and ways to better implement space travel into your games, whatever they are. I'm also really interested in your experiences. Have you found it challenging to run space combat in your games? Have you found it fun? Have you found that a game runs it so much better than all the others, and what is that game? I'd love to know what that game is so I can borrow some rules from it. So that's it. That's the show, and until next time, don't forget to wash your hands.